Tov. Today's daf yomi is Shevuos daf Chav Beis, Shevuos 22. We're going to start Medrash Hashem Yisbarach on the bottom of Chav Aleph from the base, 3 lines from the bottom. Today's daf is dedicated for Shmir for the Chayalim, Hatzah for the Shuyim, and Yeshua for Am Yisrael. That we had said that the Rabbanan said to Rabbi Akiva that if you take an oath not to eat something and you eat it, you're liable if you eat an olive size amount, like a zayas, which Rabbi Akiva says you're liable even if you eat a mashu. So Rabbanan said to Rabbi Akiva, where else do we find a situation where you're liable even though you only eat a little bit and you don't eat an olive size amount? Amar lo Rabbi Akiva, Hechan Matzinu. The Gemara says, aren't there other cases? Varei Nemoa. What about the case of an ant? It's very small. It's much smaller than an olive. So the Gemara says, very Yashani. It's its own creature, and so therefore that case is different. And Rashi explains that because it's its own entity, it's chashuv, it's chashiva, it's distinguished as though, and therefore, even though it's not an olive size, it's going to be considered eating, and so therefore you're liable. Vare hektish. What about if somebody says consecrated food item as hektish? He's liable, even if it's more than a kedayah. So Gemara says, no, hektish is different. How about inon shava pruta? By hektish, we require it to be worth a certain amount of money. And so even though it's not an olive exactly, but we have a different share, and it has to be something significant. The Gemara says, mefaresh. Well, what about the case of mefaresh? So what about the case of somebody who says, I take an oath that I'm not going to eat a breadcrumb? He's liable. Gemara says, no, mefarish nami kabir yadami. Mefarish is, he said this amount, so it's chashuv. So that's like the case of the birya, and therefore he's liable. Mari afar, what about the case of earth? If he says an oath that he's not going to eat any earth, and Gemara's assumption at this point is that since earth is not edible, so therefore you're liable in any amount, because the whole idea of edible of an olive comes from that's what's called eating. But earth is not called eating, so you should be liable even if it's less than an olive size. Very afar. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, if you're going to say that you're liable for an afar and less than an ounce, so therefore we have to say he's from the fact that you say that he's liable for every case for an olive. You want to say that afar earth is also only liability for an olive. So then we should be able to answer Rava's question on top of Chaf Beis and Aleph. A person says Shevuos shelo ochal v'achal afar, but kama. If a person says an oath that he's not going to eat earth, and then he eats the earth with respect to how much is he liable? So why don't we say from here he has to eat an olive size? No, Tip showed Adi Kazayas. Why don't we say from here he's liable once he has a Kazayas? The Gemara says no. Kikamrina, and when do we say you need an olive size? We say this by something that's edible, a food item. But so earth is not edible, and so therefore it's not necessarily a Kazayas. Vare konamos. What about if a person says konemalai, takes an oath, and he says he's not going to eat something that is prohibited, even any small amount? The Gemara says, "Konamos nami k'mefarish tami." No, the lashon of konam, the lashon of a vow, is like basically is like the case of mefarish, because there he doesn't say anything about food, but he's basically saying any amount. So now the Gemara says, Amar. Well, Rabbi Akiva responded in the Mishnah, carbon. Carbon. You question me about we never see anything else where it's less than an olive size, but I say to you, we never see any other example where a person speaks, and then if he violates it, he has to bring a carbon. In this case, it's different because he speaks and he has to bring a carbon. The Gemara says, "Below, is there no other case? What about the case of a Megadev? For a Megadev, somebody Rahman al curses God, somebody Rahman al curses Hashem." And good morning, Hobbs. We're just at the 2 dots on the top of 22a, 4 lines from the top. The Gemara has said that if somebody speaks, Rabbi Akiva said, is there any other case where somebody speaks and he has to bring a carbon? Obviously, the case of violating an oath is different, and therefore, even though it's less than an olive size, you're liable. So the Gemara says, is there really no other case where, as a result of your speech, you have to bring a carbon? What about the case of a Megadev, somebody who's Mevarech as Hashem, that this is somebody who's Rahman al curses Hashem, that Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan argue about this in Krisus, and he says, Rabbi Akiva says that he brings a carbon. So the Gemara says, no, Medaber va'oser kamrin. And that's what we talk about, that there's no other case where the Medaber brings a carbon. That's what we mean, where somebody who's Medaber, he says something and he prohibits it upon himself. Nowhere else do we have a case where he brings a carbon. Morning, Shia. We're 6 lines from the top on 22a. So that's what it means. No other place where the Medaber brings a carbon as a consequence of this, of a consequence of something being prohibited to him. The high Medaber v'chote, whereas the Megadef is not somebody who speaks and something's prohibited, but he's somebody who speaks and commits a sin. Mar says, what about a Nazir? Vare Nazir. What about the Nazir? He speaks and he prohibits prohibits things upon himself, and on the day that he has to shave himself, he brings a carbon. Very Nazir, maybe. So the Gemara says, very Nazir, maybe carbano al diburo kamrina. No, we're talking about a case where somebody has to bring a carbon as a result of words that they said. And this is slightly different, meaning to say he didn't keep his words. But this Nazir, maybe carbon last year lechamra. He's not bringing a carbon because he didn't keep his words. He's bringing a carbon to allow him to drink wine. So that's something else. So that case is different. That case is different. Okay. So the Nazir is bringing a carbon not because he did not keep his word, but in order to allow him to drink the wine. Gemara says, "Very hektish." What about somebody who says something is hektish? He speaks, and as a result of his words, he prohibits that which something that he's makdish. And if he changes his words and benefits from it, that's called me'ila, and he has to bring a carbon if he does it accidentally. So the Gemara says, "Very hektish." Oser la'atzmo kamrinan. High oser kol amkulan. No, hektish is different. Hektish is something which is prohibited on the whole world. And we were saying, is there something where you prohibit just upon yourself? Vare konamos. But what about if a person does a konamos? He takes a vow to make something prohibited upon him as though it's a carbon. And so therefore, if he eats from it, the assumption is that he brings carbon me'ila, because konam is a lashon of hektish. Gemara says no. The Gemara's position is kasavar. Rabbi Akiva's position me'ila bekonamos, that if you say konam alai, that's not going to be called me'ila, and therefore you don't bring a carbon, because it's he said it's basically Rashi says the arina be mikdashei Hashem sharechu and who it's a kol adam. He's viewing it for himself as hektish, but vis-a-vis everybody else, it's considered to be chulin. So therefore, you don't bring a carbon on it. Amarava. So now we had said that. Remember back in the Mishnah, that according to the Rabbanan, you bring a carbon on only if you eat a kazayas after you took an oath not to eat. And Rabbi Akiva says if you eat any amount, you bring a carbon. Gemara now says, Amarava, this machokis is bistam, where you did not specify. You said, I'm not going to eat, an oath, I'm not going to eat bread, and then you didn't specify anything. And so the Rabbanan say it's kazayas, or Rabbi Akiva says kol shel, but you say, I take an oath, I'm not going to eat a bread crumb. Even the Rabbanan would say you're liable, even if you just eat any amount, a breadcrumb. My timer, mefarish nami kabir yadame, because if it's mefarish, as Rashi said earlier, it's chashuv, and so therefore it's like a birya, which is chashuv. It's something distinguished and important, and so therefore you're liable even for that small amount. Where is there an argument between the Rabbanan who say kazayas and Rabbi Akiva who says any amount? If you say, take an oath, I'm not going to eat anything. But if you take an oath, I'm not going to taste anything. Tasting is different than eating. Everybody says it's any amount. Even the Rabbanan. Pshita, Gemara says, isn't that obvious? No, he doesn't say to eat, it's to taste. So it's like breadcrumbs. So Gemara says, no, Ma'adatema, little nami kedamri inchi. You might have thought tasting means eating. I'll bite to eat, a taste to eat. You might have thought it's like eating and you're liable only for kazayas, according to Rabbanan Kamash one. No, tasting is different than eating. Shevuos. There's a lot of distinctions in between tasting and eating. Like, for example, let's say you just taste some food while you're cooking. Are you fleshik? Or if you just taste something, are you allowed to taste something on a fast day and then spit it out? Is that considered eating or not? Or maybe chewing gum, you're not eating it, you're just tasting it. Amar Papa Machokes b'Shevuos. This dispute between the Rabbanan and Rebbe Kiva is where you'd say a shvua that I'm not going to eat a loaf of bread. But if you say this bread is prohibited upon me like a vow, then we're going to say Divrei Hakol B'Kol Shu. Even the Rabbanan would say it's any amount you're going to be liable. My timer. Konamos nami kimin lo midkar shmad achila, because he doesn't say I'm not going to eat it. He just says konam alai. Bread is konam alai, so he just uses an expression of konem and not an expression of eating. It's like he said any amount. It's like he specified it. So Meisvei, the Gemara challenges this teaching of Rav Papa, because we say in the Brisa, Shnei konamos mitzdarfin, two konam utterances combined together to make presumably a kazayis. Whereas shtei Shevuos, whereas 2 loaves of bread that you took an oath, I took an oath against this loaf and an oath against this loaf, they don't combine. You need each one to have a kazayis. Rabbi Meir Omer konamos kishvuos. So Rabbi Meir says the konamos are like the shvuos. And if you're going to say like Rav Papa just said that chayav b'kol shu, that by konamos you're liable for any amount, then what are we talking about combining them together? Shnei konamos mitzdarf. It doesn't make sense if it's any amount that you're liable. So the Gemara says, no, what's the case that we're talking about? The case that we're talking about is the Amar Achila Mizu Alai, or Konem Achila Mizu Alai. So he says, the expression, he says, Achila. So what are we talking about? We're talking about a case where he says, Achila Mizu Alai Konem, Achila Mizu Alai Konem, meaning that he uses an expression of Achila within the Konem. And in that case, we say that since he uses the expression of Konem, in that Shvua, they could combine. So therefore, it's not a question because he also uses an expression of achila. So therefore, we need a kazayis in that case. But if that's the case, why are they combining? Well, if he split it up and in each one there's not going to be a shear, and he said achila on each one, there's not a kazayis for each one. So why are we combining them? No. Gemara says no. The exact language that he uses, the amar achila mishtein alai konem. He says eating from both of these pieces of bread is konem alai, and so therefore he's able to combine it. Gemara says, well, if that's the case, if the parallel case to that in Shevuos, he should be able to combine the kavase gabe Shevuos, tamar Shevuos shalocham mishtein, and Shevuah that I'm not going to eat from these 2 loaves of bread. Amayim mitzdarfin. Why are they not combining? So Amar Pinchas, or Pinchas explains why they don't combine. Shani Shevuos mitoch shachalukos lechatos e mitzdarfos. He says. So Rav Pinchas's answer is that the case of Shevuos is different than the case of a konamos, because the 2 loaves of bread that he swore upon them, he says lo chol mizu, says I'm not going to eat from this and this. The chalukos lechatos, that there's a distinction there. If he ate a kazayis from each one separately, he's going to be liable for 2 chatos. So therefore, it's logical to assume a mitzdarfos. They don't combine to 1 kazayis, but by konamos. There's no chalukah karbanos, and so therefore, since we say there's no chalukah karbanos there, then he's only going to be liable 1 asham by the konem, and so therefore, since he says the 2 kikaros with the 1 achila, we're going to say that they're going to combine. The Gemara says the hachi Meir Omer konamos b'shvuos. What does Rabbi Meir's phrase mean when he says the konamos are like the Shevuos? Bishlama Shevuos. I understand why Shevuos are going to combine all the chalukas lechatos. I understand why we say that the Shevuos. I understand why the Shevuos don't combine because they're distinct as it relates to the chatos. El konamos amai low, but according to Rabbi Meir, who says the konamos, when Rabbi Meir says that konamos are like the Shevuos, that they don't combine. I understand why the Shevuos don't combine because the Shevuos are chalukos lechatos. But why won't the konamos combine? They are distinct as it relates to the carbon. So the Gemara says, Epoch, reverse it. Meir Omar Shevuos konamos v'leislei. So we have to say that Shevuos are like konamos, not that konamos are like the Shevuos, that they're not able to combine, just the opposite. That The Shevuos are like the Konamos in that they do combine to make one shear. And he does not agree with the Shita of Rav Pinchas that because they're distinct for Karbanos, they're not mitzarfos to the shear. So that's the answer that the Gemara lands on here. But then the Gemara gives a different answer. Ravina says, Kika Amar Rav Papa. No, when Rav Papa says that konamos are liable for any amount, when does he say that? Even though what does Rav Papa say? Machokus b'shvuos of konamos divrei kol b'kol shehu. And then we had the problem of this contradictory brisa, which says that the shnei konamos mitzdarfen. So Rav Papa's statement that the konamos are liable for kol shehu seems to contradict the brisa, which says that they combine. Because why do we need them to combine if they're liable for any amount? So it says Ravina. Ravina says the following. Ravina says, Kika Amar Rav Papa, when Rav Papa says Konamos are kol shehu in Malkus, that's only with respect to lashes. That's where we say it's kol shehu. But when this Brisa says that they combine Konamos, that's inyan carbon. That's with respect to bring the carbon from Me'ila, to bring the Asham, the Be'ina and Shava Pruta. There we require an amount of a Shava Pruta, that if you said 2 loaves of bread by Konam, they have to, therefore we need to say it's at least a Shava Pruta. Mean to say, from the case of our Brisa, the Gemara says, how's Ravina understanding the Brisa? That there is mi'ila b'kainamos, that there's like there's mi'ila if you benefit from hektish, so too there's mi'ila. It's considered mi'ila that you're trespassing on a temple property if you said this piece of bread is a neder upon me. Is that really the case? V'atanya, didn't we learn kikor zo hektish, that a person who says this loaf of bread is hektish v'achla, and he eats from this loaf of bread, bein chavero, whether he or his friend Mal, because he made it hektish, so now he's trespassing on it. Therefore, it can also be redeemed. But if he says, if he says this loaf of bread is hektish only upon me, i.e., he makes it a neder, humal v'chavero lo mal, that he is trespassing and not his friend. Therefore, it cannot be redeemed. Divrei Rabbi Meir. That's Rabbi Meir's position. Rabbi Meir says there is mi'ila by konamos, whereas the Chachamim are on top of 22b. The Chachamim are of the position beinu ben chaver lo mal. Chachamim say no, there's no mi'ila there. Lefisha ein mi'ila by konamos, because there's no mi'ila by konamos. It's just a vow upon yourself. So how come in our bright here, according to Ravina, the Rabbanan are saying when it says kinos mitzdarfos, it means for a carbon, but the Rabbanan say there's no mi'ila about karbanon. More says epoch. So say the Rabbanan say there's mi'ila. Rameir says they're not. So echad zev lo mo'al l'fish ein mi'ila b'karnamos. That different Rameir. Rameir says there's no mi'ila by karnamos. Chamim omrim hu mo'al v'chaver lo mo'al. The Chum say there is mi'ila by karbanos. Yachi Rameir omer karnamos k'shvuos. If that's the case where Meir says konamos are like Shevuos, for what is he saying? That the konamos are like Shevuos, that when the Meir says konamos are like Shevuos, we learned in the Brisa where Meir says that konamos are like Shevuos, that they don't combine to say that you're a karmila el konamos. It's the rufe udom, it's the rufe hamiila ispu. What do you mean that the konamos are not combining, but there is miila? Meaning to say, he says they don't combine, but on their own there would be miila. Rabbi Meir, how can it be a miila b'konamos kal? Doesn't Rabbi Meir say that there's no miila with konamos at all? So the Gemara says, "L'divrayim de Rabbanan kamer." No, Rabbi Meir is speaking according to the shita of the Rabbanan. He says, "L'di a meila b'konamos kal." According to me, I say there's no meila with konamos at all. But according to you, odu mias, at least agree to me the konamos Shevuos, that Konomos are like Shevuos, and they don't combine. The Rabbanan say, no, we don't accept that. Shevuos Ika Rav Pinchas. The reason why by Shavua they don't, there's not, it's not mitzvah, it's because Rav Pinchas' logic that they're mechulakos l'chatos, they're distinct as it relates to sin offering. But konamos leika Rav Pinchas. But when it comes to konamos, we don't have the shita of Rav Pinchas because there's only one carbon in that situation. Amar Rava. So now we get to the case of the shvua shel ochal v'ochal afar that we had said. Rava says if a person says I an oath that I'm not going to eat, and then he eats earth, that's not considered eating and he's putter, because that when you say eating, it doesn't include those things that are not edible, like earth. Even though I've seen people eating earth in my life, that's not what normal people do. And so therefore it's not considered part of his oath. So therefore he's not liable for eating earth. So by Rava, let's say you eat on Yom Kippur, it's relevant, you eat something that's not edible, let's say you eat a stick on Yom Kippur, it's not food. So you're not liable. So by Rava, Shvuah shel ochel offer b'kama. Let's say he says an oath that I'm not going to eat earth. How much is he liable for? Kimin damar shel ochel. Maybe since he used an expression of eating, achila daite akazais. Maybe he's liable if it's an olive size amount. Odoma kimin lo midi achila inchi. Maybe because this is something that people don't eat. B'kol show. So therefore, under those circumstances, it's going to be any amount because we only do kizayis when it's achila. So tomorrow leaves it as take unresolved. By Rabba Shvuah shel ochel chartzan. Right, so he takes an oath he's not going to eat the grape seed. Bekama. How much is he liable? Since grape seeds are eaten only as part of something else, since he only eats the grape seeds by mixing them together, by making, like with a grape, that's how you eat it together to make a full amount. So therefore, daite akazais. Maybe he says it has to be an olive size amount with the full other foods. Odoma kimin lo ba'ine achilei inche daite amashu. Since people don't really have in mind since people don't eat it on its own, since it's not eaten on its own, therefore, and he says a grape seed really means even any amount. So Gemara again leaves this question unresolved. Let's say a Nazir says an oath that I'm not going to eat a grape seed, really, because the grape seed is prohibited to a Nazir. And so therefore he takes this oath. Now Rashi explains the question. If you want to say by all other people it's grape seed is with the kazayas, what about by a Nazir? Do we say since the Nazir is already prohibited to eat the grape seed, and he knows that the shvuah doesn't take effect on a full olive size amount, so therefore his intent here is only on a mashu, on a little amount. That's the question. Rava. So let's say Ravashi Nazir says an oath that I will not eat a grape seed. Become the given the kazayas, it's sure they're right. So since if it's a full olive size amount, the biblical prohibition. When he takes the oath here, he's intending on the part that's allowed, which is less than an olive. V'daite amashu, he intends on any amount. Dilmor, perhaps we say, since he says that I'm not going to eat anything, daite akzayis, really, he's intending to eat an olive size amount. He's intending to eat an olive size amount, and so therefore there's no oath at all here because you can't take an oath on something that's already prohibited from the Torah. Gemara says, let's answer this question. So we answer it from our Mishnah that takes an oath that he's not going to eat anything and he eats this food that's not kosher. Chayiv is going to be liable. And Rabbi Shimon Potter. And Rabbi Shimon says he's exempt for the oath. He's exempt. Has not violated his oath. So why are you liable in that case? Isn't this a case where you already took an oath from Sinai? So Rav Shmuel Rabbi Yochanan the Amrei. No, what's the reason? We call Dvarim HaMutarmim Dvarim HaAsurim. So Rav and Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan, they all explain that since the Mishnah is talking about a case where the person includes permitted things with prohibited things, and so therefore the oath will take effect, because since he says since he took an oath that he's not going to eat anything, and that includes non-kosher food, but it also includes kosher food, therefore the oath takes effect. And so therefore he's in violation. Reish Lakish Amar, no, I'll tell you why you're liable. Iyata Motze, what are we talking about? Ela Iba Mefarish. So what we're talking about a case is where a person said, I'm not going to eat like a drop of the nevela. Iyat Motze Ela Iba Mefarish Chatzishi, or Valiba Draban. According to Rabban, who would say you have liability, who say that you're not, according to Rabban, Chatzishir is something that if he takes an oath as a general rule, his intent is not to prohibit any amount. And so therefore, only if he says specifically he's going to do less than a shear will he have liability. And since it's not Mushma Muma Mehar Sinai, therefore he's liable in this case as well. Or if he just says a baseline where he's always liable on any amount, and it's according to Rabbi Akiva, who says that you're liable even for a mashu, and therefore the nevela, since that wasn't prohibited from the Torah mashu, therefore you're liable in this case. So that's how in this case the Rabbanan are saying you're chayiv. The Amar Adam Otzar Atzmar Kolshmo. But nevela the mushba be'umam har Sinai hu the chichar tzon gabe nazir damya. So the nevela, since it's already prohibited from Sinai, it's like this grapeseed with respect to the nazir, that it's permitted if it's less than the amount. The time of the parish, and what's the reason why Reish Lakish is saying you're liable in the case of the nevela? Only because you're mefarish. Hello, parish, but if he wouldn't do it, daitei kazayis, his intent would be to say an olive-sized amount. And so Shema Minah, we see from here that as a baseline, your intent is on the olive-sized amount, and so the oath wouldn't take effect. Well, if that's the case, Tivsha to buy Rava. So why don't we answer the case that question that Rava asked earlier? Shevuos ochel afar bekama. If you take an oath that you're not going to eat earth, how much is that referring to? Tivshot. Why don't we answer this question? The adi kazayis until it's an olive-sized amount. The nevela ka afar damya, because nevela, just like the afar, just like the nevela is something that is not typically eaten by a Jew, and nevertheless we say that your baseline intent is kazayis, so it's like the afar in that they're both not typically eaten. The time of the flourish, and the reason why it's considered like an oath that you can't eat it is because only where you're mefarish. But if you're not mefarish, all parish, daite kazayis. If you don't specify it's on a kazayis, so say that the afar is also liable for a kazayis. Gemara says no. Afar lav barachil huklal. Offer is not something you ever eat. And so therefore we're going to say, we might think it's even prohibited on any amount. But nevela ba'asachila, nevela, even though it's mushba umam mehar Sinai, even though you don't eat it, it is something that's typically eaten. And therefore, what's the reason why you're not eating it? Are you because the lion is crouching over you to stop you from eating it. And so therefore you can't learn anything about offer from there. So just say very quickly this Mishnah, Shevuos ochel va'achol v'shas. So he takes an oath he's not going to eat, and then eats and drinks. Eino chayav el. So then eating includes drinking. Shevuos ochel v'shal eshter, but it says two things, that I won't eat and won't drink, and achol v'shas chayav shtayim, then he's liable for two. Shevuos ochel v'achol pas klitin pasta, or in pas kusmin, eino chayav el. If he says I'm not going to eat, and then eats wheat, barley, and spelt, he's liable once. Shevuos ochel pas klitin pasta, or in pas kusmin, if he specifies he's liable for each one. He says an oath I'm not going to drink. B'shas the mashkin arbet, he drink a lot of different liquids. He's liable one. But if he specifies, liable for each one. Let's say 8 foods that are not edible. Or he drank liquids that are not capable of drinking. Potter is exempt. Let's say he says an oath that I'm not going to eat these non-kosher foods, chayiv. He's liable. Rabbi Shimon Potter. Rabbi Shimon says no, he's exempt because he's already mushba from Har Sinai. And we had to say, how is he liable in that case? And that's what we were just discussing. How is he liable? Either according to Rabbi Akiva, bit kosher, according to Rabbanan, the mefarish. Amar konim ishti nenesli. He says, my wife will not have any benefit from me in machalti ayom if I ate today. His wife is prohibited because he ate foods that were capable of being eaten. So, okay, we'll stop here and say to Rabbi Yosef,